Hi everyone, good morning. Hope you enjoy the conference. As you heard from the introductions upstairs, some of our interest here, one of the reasons we're here is to look at how the ideas from the Pittsburgh school can be applied to philosophy of education, and that's one of the things I've tried to do in this presentation, specifically McDowell's reference to Marx in Mind and World. So I want to have a look at that and also see if I can apply it specifically to teaching of English in the UK, specifically at GCSE level, so 16-year-olds. So the idea here for me is that McDowell uses Marx's concept of alienated labour to kind of highlight the social, communal and normative aspects inherent in human nature. And that part of my argument is that we can deduce from this that a failure to appreciate these aspects in human nature leads to a kind of reductive naturalism, according to McDowell, and to alienation in learning, which is what I'm arguing. So we come out with this alienation process and reductive naturalism, both in labour and in learning, which I hope to show with an example from English. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the philosophy. So what exactly does McDowell say about Marx, or why does he draw on Marx? In what way does he draw on him? How these things connect philosophically, McDowell and Marx. Then move on to what I'm calling alienated learning and how this manifests in GCSE English with a specific example that I'm going to go through, and then finish with some implications. So if you kind of accept the idea that there is such a thing as alienated learning, then what might this mean? How could we address it in education and more specifically in English? So something I should say from the beginning is that when I thought of doing this, I thought, oh, that's a good idea, alienated learning, that's a catchy title, and did quite a lot of work on it, only to find out that someone had got there first. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually a bit different from this article, but I wanted to make people aware, if you weren't already aware of it, that this is an excellent paper where the writers take Marx's essay on alienated labour and they kind of rewrite it completely as alienated learning. I highly recommend it. But I'm going in a slightly different direction today, so that didn't scupper me, I'm happy to say. Yeah, so part one, McDowell and Marx. So the basic idea, so the overview for me is that McDowell talks about naturalised second nature. So people may be familiar with that, but if you're not, I'm just going to go through that a bit. So naturalised second nature contrasts with what you might call our first or biological or animal nature or merely animal nature. Alienated labour, if you're familiar with Marx, which I assume you are, is work that estranges us from ourselves rather than allowing us to fulfill our human capacities. Obviously, there's more you can say about it. And my argument is that alienated learning occurs when reason and our nature are conceived as divided. So somehow, based on McDowell's idea, we get this separation in our view of learners with their reason and their nature. Okay, so in Mind and World, in Lecture 6 of Mind and World, McDowell mentions Marx, and there's all this talk about animals are like this and humans are like that. So there's this kind of contrast that's set up, and these two images might sort of help to illustrate what I think McDowell's getting at, and that's, people might look at human beings a bit like the chimpanzees in the picture at the top there, that, somehow we are just really advanced tool users and really advanced social groups, and that this picture in the bottom is just a kind of, if you just move the chimps further on in time, and that's it. But that would be one way of characterising a kind of animal nature and contrasting it with what McDowell is saying. So in other words, there's two different kinds of naturalism that McDowell is talking about. One is this kind of biological animal way of looking at things, and the other is second nature, or this other kind of naturalism. So that's an important component in the idea of alienated learning, because McDowell's argument is that we develop this second nature, or it's extended through socialization, upbringing, and education. So part of the sort of thesis behind this presentation is that by sort of not seeing reason and nature as reason within nature, you get this kind of alienating effect. You get this reductive effect in how we can look at human beings, or how we can look at learners. So we kind of maybe, all this emphasis sometimes on, what's going on in the brain or whatever, is a sort of can be taken to an extreme, and can be seen. We can see learners in reductive terms, or educational policy makers or educational thinkers might see learners in reductive terms. So this idea. So another way of thinking about that is when McDowell talks about bald naturalism, or if you want to use the term scientism, hence the picture at the top there, where people look at scientific ideas or ideas about neuroscience or what's going on in a learner's brain as a kind of way to improve their educational theory or whatever, which may well be good in some ways, but misses out often this kind of second nature component, which is really important for if the learning situation involves appreciating norms and normativity and so on, which I hope to show with the GCSE example in a moment. So in lecture 6 of Mind and World, McDowell specifically references the 1844 manuscript by Marx, and he directly cites the section on alienated labour, and he's doing, obviously wouldn't be able to go into every aspect of it here in a short presentation, but there are several kind of components to it, and one is this idea of wanting to exorcise the passive observer. So, this idea that somehow, we take in information from our senses and we automatically kind of get knowledge. We look at something like a banana and we think, yeah, that's yellow. So all of this kind of conceptual stuff and conceptual framework that we have, and the inferential framework between concepts, gets kind of ignored in favour of this kind of reductive naturalism. Somehow we're just getting this knowledge automatically, passively, without necessarily enough attention being given to the world, how the world has helped to get us to a point of understanding concepts like colour and so on. And likewise in McDowell, in this lecture 6, he draws a contrast between an environment and a world. So animals have an environment. They have all sorts of behaviours that help them adapt themselves to the environment, like a beaver building a dam or whatever. But that's not the same thing as when we build a dam, because obviously humans building a dam presupposes all kinds of things about society, community. It's not just more complicated. There's a whole world that is supporting the reasons why we build that dam in the first place. And Marx also draws the same sort of contrast. He talks about animals producing, and bees and beavers and so on, doing really complicated things as they respond to their needs, but humans are different. So there's a really strong overlap here, really strong connection rather, between McDowell's idea of second nature and various ideas in Marx, including his idea of species being. So looking around more specifically at Marx as well, we can see that in Marx's scholarship, there is this reference directly to second nature as well. So, you know, second nature is something that we can see clearly in Marx's ideas, in his emphasis on what is going on in our social activity and what can go wrong as well in it, leading to alienation. And obviously that's with my argument is that that happens in labour, but it also can happen in learning as well. There's an interesting kind of distinction in phraseology as well. So we've got kind of phraseology about what's going on in society, but also something that's a bit more specific and a bit more nuanced, and that's human sociality. So sociality is something that's more inherent, and you could see that again in sort of second nature terms, and this again links with the second nature idea. So in some ways you can say society may justifiably not be called natural, whereas sociality is rightly defined as man's second nature. So I think for me, and I'd be interested if people agree or disagree with this afterwards, but for me that's a very strong connection between McDowell and Marx, this kind of emphasis on second nature. So I believe people a lot of the scholarship on alienated labour often argues or sets out that there are these sort of four components or four aspects of alienated labour. So being alienated from the product, the act of production, from your own species, essence or being, and from other workers. So I'm doing something, you know, in a way relatively crude, because I'm saying, you know, in a way we can sort of map that on, a little bit like the article I referred to at the beginning, the McDermott and Lave article, and we can sort of see that if we were going to do this mapping, we can sort of see where some of it might go. Okay, obviously that would be a longer piece of work, but the bit that interests me today, that I think we can directly talk about in the way that McDowell talks about Marx or draws on Marx, is this idea here, this connection here, that learners can be alienated from their species being or their second nature in how learning activities are set up or designed, or how they're theorized, or the philosophy behind them, if you like. So the argument that I'm going to make when we come to English, the English example, is that somehow students are being separated from what they might naturally infer or naturally understand about something, and of course naturally in this McDowellian sense and not this kind of animal sense that we've touched on. Okay, so that's a little bit about the McDowell and Marx. So what do I mean about applying it to say something like English? So first thing, if you could just take a minute. So this is an extract from a GCSE English language exam from 2020. It's the section of the exam is reading comprehension. So the students have to read this passage first. This is the first bit. So I'll just give you a minute to read it, read what you can, and then I'll move on. It should go off in a minute. Thank you. Okay, well, there isn't going to be a test, and I'll be talking a little bit more about it, but hopefully you've got a sort of gist of it, and I may kind of flick back to it if need be. So anyway, so if you imagine the scenario, the students have been, obviously they've had all the lessons that build up to the exam, so it's kind of how, there's all the problems of teaching to the test and so on. And there's also the sort of broader problem of how reading comprehension is being conceived, right? What is it that we are asking students to do, or what do we think we're asking students to do, and what do they think they're being asked to do? So the first question in the exam, after they've read the, I'll come on to that in a second, hang on, just take a step back. So that was the sort of, so that you've got the source in the back of your mind. So what am I going to say now about this particular example? So one thing that I want to say is that if we had a more McDowellian informed and McDowellian Marxist informed English curriculum, there wouldn't be this kind of sidelining or ignoring of various kind of normative understanding that students can bring into their understanding of what they read, okay? So it's in a way, by ignoring that, we're sort of shortchanging students and not giving them an opportunity to show that understanding or develop that understanding. And in fact, we're sort of, in the example that I'm going to go through, there's a kind of a very reductive way of kind of looking at what's going on when students are reading and comprehending what they read. Okay, and this does touch on broader issues in English as well. For example, in quite a big document that's important for me, looking at philosophy of education and specifically with English, is this Ofsted document that talks a lot about words and grammar as kind of one thing that students need to understand, and kind of background contextual knowledge as something else, but then doesn't really give a clear account or much support to teachers in terms of policy about how they're supposed to do this. So there's a kind of dualism where there's a sort of tacit acknowledgement that these two things are important, but there's a lot more emphasis on words and grammar than there is on this important contextual stuff. So as I say, it's as if teachers, examiners and so on have to favour, in policy terms, the words, and philosophically speaking, the words and grammar side. So yeah, putting semantics and syntax on one side and norms and second nature on the other. So you had a look at the extract. The very first question in the exam asked students to just focus on this section, these 4 lines. And it's supposedly a very straightforward sort of comprehension question. Can you list 4 things about Rosie? Okay, so you might want to think just for 10 seconds now or 20 seconds now, what 4 things would you list? Okay, I'll just give you a second to do that. Okay, and as I say, there's not going to be a test, but you might want to mentally mark yourself in a minute. So if we look at the mark scheme, so obviously for any exam, there's the examiners get guidance on how they're supposed to mark it or whatever, and this is the mark scheme for that question. So as you can see, there are various kind of indicative, there is a little bit more to the explanation, but this is a sort of relevant bit to focus on for now. So these are sort of acceptable answers or correct answers, and these are answers that examiners are explicitly told to reject, okay? So if we just sort of go back a second. So yeah, I mean, some of them are sort of fairly obvious. She's at a new house and so on. Rosie has a car is an interesting one because this clearly, in terms of the exam, would be implied, rather implicit information rather than explicit, because it does say she drove, but it doesn't say explicitly that it's her car. You know, what if she borrowed a car or whatever? But it's the rejected answers that interest me the most in this one. So these two that I've starred here. So the first, the sunlight one, as you can see, the students are being sort of picked up on the fact that they according to the guidance, according to the scheme, they stopped reading when it got to the end of the line. So you can sort of see, okay, so that's I mean, I have some issues with that, but you can kind of see that, okay, that's a mistake. You should have read on to the... But then you've got this one here, Rosie's watching her children. Now, it already says... so they're supposed to focus on here. So they've already kind of explained in the kind of supporting introduction to the source that it is Rosie's children. And as you might have gathered when you read it yourself, there's kind of quite a lot of implicit information here about where you might get the idea that they're her children. But so my question is, you know, why is this wrong? And what's that? We could ask, what's that got to do with the sort of McDowell, Marx ideas? Right. So in the examiner report, so it explains explains the issue with the sunlit line ending. You know, that's a mistake. But when we get to the the bit about Rosie was watching her children playing, so the examiner's report's commenting on the fact that some students did say, yes, Rosie's watching her children, but then the explanation given for why this is incorrect is a grammatical explanation about that she's watching the garden, right? So it's the idea that she's not looking at her children, she's looking at the overgrown garden, okay, rather than her children or the garden where her children are playing or whatever. So what I'm arguing here is there's a kind of emphasis here on, well, grammatically it says this, therefore that's what the correct answer is, and any kind of idea that this is a parent who's washing up, looking out the window, and might be looking, observing or supervising her children. So this kind of normative situation and this normative understanding of what's going on in that narrative scene is getting sort of rejected. As an English teacher, of course, grammar interests me. It's something, it doesn't interest everyone, but it interests me, but not at the expense of all of these other aspects of what's going on in reading, which is one of the reasons why I picked up on this. So just to sort of run through it briefly, we can break down a key part of this text in more detail, but what it sort of ends up being really is just the kind of, so this is me going through it saying, well, how did the examiner get to this view that this should be rejected? And you just sort of end up with this kind of, you just get embroiled in all of the grammar. So you get this whole thing about the structure of the clause can be interpreted in more than one way. There's ambiguity in the syntax. You can sort of read it as she's looking at the garden where her children are playing, as in it's a place where her children are. That's part of the reason she's looking at it. Or you can sort of read it as sort of incidental supplementary information. And in fact, the fact that it doesn't have a comma and all of this can have some bearing on how you read the sentence. But that's not really what concerns me. It's more the fact that there's just this focus on words and grammar as opposed to the things that we might consider normative and involving second nature and encouraging students to sort of bring that understanding into what they read. And just to sort of make the point more emphatically, this isn't just about, that particular sentence and whether there was a comma there or not. We can have syntactic ambiguity in lots of situations. So here's a good example. Okay, so we read that, right? Most people, I don't know what your reaction to that is or your response to that, but we can sort of analyse that as actually there is some syntactic ambiguity there. We may not even see it because of the really strong normative background that we bring into play when we read a sentence like that. Hence these sort of jokes, you know, the idea that you've got to have a dog, otherwise you can't go on the escalator. So clearly there, you can sort of read that in syntax terms in two different ways, and you can create humour. But really, most people are not going to have problems understanding that sentence because of their normative understanding of what it's about. And this is something that, as an English teacher in the past, and as someone still interested in sort of developing the ideas that can help English teaching, the role of inference and background knowledge is so integral to understanding what we read that this kind of over focus on words and grammar can really do students a disservice, I think. There's lots of things in narratives that are not mentioned that we understand. So, coming towards the sort of end here, if we were able to have a more McDowellian and Marxist influenced education policy for some of the stuff that I'm talking about to do with English, we would be thinking more deeply about how we can support students to use this background knowledge that they have, and rather than sort of rejecting interpretations that might be based on those, which in fact might be the sort of natural interpretation, as in the example of a parent looking out at a garden where her children are playing. This also comes up in not just reading comprehension for English language, but it clearly comes into literary interpretation. There's a great paper by John McDowell about a working class student who's in a Romeo and Juliet lesson, and they're doing the what's in a name speech, and the teacher is really astounded by the insight that the student is able to bring to Romeo and Juliet and the meaning of this specific passage in the play by drawing on his knowledge of Romeo and Juliet and the class theme there, but also his knowledge of what a class society is like and why what is a name is relevant to that in terms of one's social and class identity. So this is a bit of the presentation that I haven't necessarily completely developed yet, so I'd be interested if anyone has any comments or ideas about it. But I kind of sense in this McDowellian Marxist perspective that it could be used in a critique of neoliberal education, because it seems to be a sort of, I like the way this scholar puts it, there's a kind of logical mistake happening. It's like, why are we focusing on something like in the example of the syntax? Why are we focusing so exclusively on that at the expense of these other things? It just sort of seems both a logical and a professional mistake to sideline this other information. And I would argue it sort of reveals, in a way, the bald naturalism that McDowell is warning against, and that somehow we have to ground our understanding of what's going on in reading comprehension in something like syntax alone, or semantic understanding or something. And on the Marxist side, Marxism side, it's also sort of can create this alienating effect where your knowledge of parental norms or parental expectations or families is considered a sort of irrelevance compared to something more mundane. So yeah, just to sort of finish off, really specific thing that I would take from the example, the English example, is Syntax and semantics doesn't exhaust pragmatic and normative meaning, which is obviously an important idea in Pittsburgh school, and that it's quite a natural thing in McDowell's second kind of naturalism that a scene like this would be understood as involving supervision or watching children, even if doing other tasks. It's quite a natural inference, and rather than rejecting this sort of thing when students are reading and commenting on what they read, I think that they should be encouraged and built upon and shaped by teachers to enhance textual understanding rather than reject what they say. So for Marx, we develop our species being through productive activity, and what I'm arguing about the Marxist, McDowellian Marxist perspective is that we can use the idea or draw on the idea of second nature within education to not do the kind of things that were evident in the exam example that I just went through. And that would mean recognising more fully the role of norms and normative understanding in learning activities. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. A great way to start the conference. So we'll come to questions in a second, which will be a bit of a funny thing since this is the microphone we've got in here. So in a second, when I ask you to put your hand up, could you speak into this so that anyone at home and on the recording can hear? Yeah, so I guess just as a first question, I was wondering, there's one interpretation of what you're saying, which I take it isn't what you mean. So Dewey started this kind of tradition where basically the idea is, well, anything the child says is right. Mm-hmm. They themselves have kind of created their own meaning. So if they say the mum is playing with the kids, then we should appreciate that. So I'm kind of interested to bring out where's the contrast to that sort of exploration learning. There's no kind of right or wrong for the kids. They create their own right or wrong. And I guess the second kind of harder step, which we're probably thinking about, is, well, what do we ask as in an exam then? What do we want kids to do in an exam?
Yeah, that second part's maybe more difficult, but on the first part, and I think that's a really good question, because it's like, can you say, well, that's what it means to me or whatever? Clearly, that isn't, as you acknowledge, that's not what I mean. The text, for want of a better way of putting this, the text has to support the interpretation or the understanding in some way. So, I can't say, Rosie's a space alien and blah, blah, I can't just say something and that's how I'm interpreting it. That's not supported in any way by the text. The thing I was trying to sort of hone in on is that it's more about what's being rejected. So something here is being explicitly rejected that is supported by the text, right? And that's more what I'm interested in. If it can be supported by the text, and we're not going to have an examiner or a teacher quibble over the grammar, then I think that we can build on those sorts of things. And in fact, you could make it a teaching moment. You could sort of say, well, okay, so if you wanted to teach grammar, you could say, okay, so here's an interesting way of looking at this sentence, blah, 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 teach something about grammar and say, well, how come, let's argue about it then. I've got a couple of other examples down here with the coffee shop. So you can sort of say, is the comma really that important in these two sentences that are exactly the same except for one comma? Does it sort of actually lead to those different interpretations? But having said all of that about grammar, there's still all this normative world that's there that shouldn't be ignored in a situation like this. But yes, I agree. I can't say, Rosie's an android or something like that. I think the second, correct me if I'm wrong.
What do you want as an exam question?
Well, obviously that's maybe another presentation, and I haven't done that bit yet. But I think obviously I would want, just in my view, a more open question. Yes, as I said in my previous response, there have to be some parameters. They can't sort of put down any answer and say, well, that's just how I interpret it. It has to be supported by the text in some way. So in that sense, you know, that is a bit reductive, but that as an example with some guidance that people, examiners can reward under certain conditions as long as it's supported, I think that would be acceptable. But I get that that's not very specific, and I'll have to think more about how to make it concrete.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, just one short question. So this is for what? Two short questions. For what ages?
Yeah. So GCSE English is normally done at 16 in the UK. It might be done early by some students, and it might be done by adults. Or, in fact, there's some good data on what happens to students who don't pass GCSE English in the UK system. So if you don't get the sort of C or whatever, the 4 or the 5 now in the new 1 to 9, it does close a lot of doors in how you progress in education and in employment. And if you go to, say, something like a further education college and you don't have your English, you can try and redo it, and you can be offered something called functional English, which is an even more sort of boiled down version. But the data on that I've seen shows that a lot of those students still don't get the GCSE grade. So yeah, anyway, that's just to say that sometimes it's students who are a little bit older than 16 or adults as well.
Is there any, the proper question, is there any tradition of complementing the exam questions with something like justify your answer? Because in Portugal, since we're 11 or 12, this was something that teachers would always be riffing about, and justify your answer was...
Yeah, so again, it would be a longer presentation, but the GCSE exam where I've taken this first question, there's a number of other questions. So there's two halves. There's the reading part, and then there's a writing part. The writing part might be a creative, write a story or a descriptive scene, right? So the writing part is testing, obviously, students' writing skills. And then the reading part, I've only picked the first question because I think, it seemed to be a good example for this particular topic. But some of the other questions are asking students to analyse how the writer has used language. So they might talk about, the students are being encouraged to talk about the writer's use of metaphors and similes and sentence structure and so on. And this is where some of that grammar knowledge might be useful, because they could talk about, the writer used a short sentence here and a longer sentence here, or a complex sentence here, or a simple sentence. If they have that knowledge, they can bring that into... but that's where they... and that's, to answer your question, that's where they might use short quotations to support their answer and justify their answer. But I suppose what I'm driving at is, if the sort of overall model is a bit... If we take that as a sort of indicating that there's this kind of underlying framework, underlying idea behind what students are doing, as in it's a sort of first kind of naturalism, not a second kind, that even in those more extended answers, there may be a kind of bias that... I'd have to look more closely at those ones, but I suspect that we might find similar problems. But
okay, we've got time for one more.
Hi, thank you. I understand and I agree with you that it's peculiar, the fact that that answer was rejected in that comprehension, because I would say that it's kind of a more advanced answer, in the sense that it's an inference that since the woman is looking at the garden, she's also looking at the children. And I'm wondering, and I see this grammatical and syntactic part, something that some students see and they're certain about, because it's there and they see it. So I'm wondering now, like when we move on, when we want students to make these inferences, because it's from these inferences that all the depth is going to come in their analysis later on, and obviously not in this exam. How do we help children step out of that syntactical understanding, it's what I see, and then go to the inference part?
Yeah, that's good. Firstly, I agree that there's something, I mean, you used the word advanced, so there's something more, there is something important going on with the student who says, yes, she's watching her children. And maybe there's, in terms of Philippe's question, maybe there's a difference between, or there's different level, a different sophistication going on if a student can then explain how they got to that inference compared to a student who just thinks that's what's going on but can't really back it up. But the other part of your question, the second part about the syntax thing, I mean, I'm not, I want to make it clear, I'm not arguing definitely, you know, I'm not arguing we shouldn't teach grammar, we shouldn't teach syntax. I find syntax, I mean, hopefully it's sort of obvious from the presentation, I find all this sort of thing quite interesting, and maybe you know, more interesting than people who are not into English or whatever. And incidentally as well, I think, picking up on what you said, there are some people that would read that sentence and form the view that, because they sort of have this understanding of grammar, that it does mean she's only looking at the garden, and they would sort of argue strongly. I read that, while I was preparing this presentation, I read it to a few people and said, what do you think this sentence is saying? What do you think about what's at the exam? And people argued against what I was saying. They were saying, no, it means she's looking at the garden. And so I think that that's an interesting side to it. But that's where I would kind of stress the point that, and this is a Pittsburgh school idea, if you like, that do we have the view that you know, that when we use language, there is a sort of pragmatic element and a normative element that can't be reduced to the syntax, even if we know all of you know, we know syntax inside out and backwards. There's still going to, hence the you know, don't take dogs on the escalator idea. You know, that we can analyse that, slice that up in a billion ways or whatever syntactically, but you still need to understand. In the world, it's pretty obvious that this is the meaning, unless you come, you know, unless you have, for some reason, don't understand what escalators are and don't understand why you might need to pick up a dog or whatever.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrick.